Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. I'm Allison Chris, Director of the University of Virginia Global Infectious Diseases Institute. We at Giddy are honored to host Dr. David Robinson from the Gates Foundation, who will speak on a highly timely topic, COVID-19 vaccines, an impressive but not perfect global response to the pandemic. We will be recording this webinar and it will be publicly available on our website, giddy.virginia.edu. The Global Infectious Diseases Institute was established in June 2017 with funding from the offices of the Vice President for Research and Executive Vice President and Provost. Our premise is that the study of global infectious diseases, it needs interdisciplinary approaches where researchers with diverse areas of expertise come together to achieve something that no one individual can. Our mission is to nucleate and support collaborative transdisciplinary research on infectious threats of global impact. Our activities include hosting workshops that bring together experts from across the University of Virginia and their local and global partners, offering competitive seed funding to launch new interdisciplinary projects, and helping research teams to publicize their work and secure extramural funding. The host of today's webinar is Dr. Michael King, who is Professor of Practice in the Department of Chemical Engineering in the University of Virginia School of Engineering and Applied Sciences. Prior to UVA, Dr. King was Senior Vice President for Science and Technology at Merck & Company. A major portion of his work at Merck was in the process development and commercialization of new pharmaceuticals and vaccines. So I would like to thank Dr. King for arranging today's webinar and invite him to now introduce Dr. Robinson.
Thank you, Allison. So anyways, I'm glad to welcome a fellow chemical engineer, Dave Robinson. Dave got his undergraduate degree at Berkeley and then his PhD at MIT, and then completed a postdoc at the Swiss Federal Institute. After his postdoc, he joined industry, and that's where I first met him at Merck when we were working on a rotavirus vaccine program, which we were doing with Paul Offit of Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. I won't go into the details, but it was a very challenging program, and Dave handled it extremely well. There were lots of zigs and zags along the way. Dave went on to become vice president of the bioprocess group, and later headed the chemistry, manufacturing, and controls group for Merck's checkpoint inhibitor, Keytruda. And I'd just like to note that both the Rotatech, which is a rotavirus vaccine, and Keytruda won the Prix Galien Award. Worldwide, that's the equivalent top prize in biopharmaceutical research. And so to have two of those is pretty much an amazing thing. So congratulations, Dave. After Merck, he had a consulting business until joining the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation as Deputy Director, CMC Vaccine Development. He was working on many projects, including polio, until the COVID pandemic hit, when he was asked to take on all CMC activities for the COVID vaccine programs at the foundation. In addition to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, he's also co-chair of the World Health Organization COVAX technical manufacturing team. And so I'm pleased to introduce David Robinson, who will speak on an impressive but not perfect global response to the pandemic. Dave?
Great, thank you very much, Mike, for the introduction. And thanks to everyone who's joined this webinar on what I believe is probably a lovely day in Virginia, and especially for this time of year. So, of course, we're going to talk about COVID today. And one of the first things to do is just look at the global picture. This is the data that's generated at Johns Hopkins University that shows the global picture. As you can see on the left-hand side, there are now over 50 million cases of coronavirus recorded globally, and you can see from the globe or the map in the middle on every continent save Antarctica. And unfortunately, this has now resulted in well over 1 million deaths worldwide. However, it's useful to place this in perspective of how coronavirus and COVID-19, how the epidemic looks relative to historical epidemics. And this graph shows you a schematic of pandemics going back to 165 AD up to the present day. And what you can see is certainly in the past 20 years, COVID-19 is the biggest epidemic we've seen with, as known to date, over 1 million deaths. However, if you go back 40 years ago, You see the HIV/AIDS epidemic is still ongoing in many parts of the world, has already caused over 25 to 35 million deaths. And if you go back 100 years to 1918, you can see the Spanish flu with that resulted in an estimated 40 to 50 million deaths. So a number of, well, there are other epidemics that have caused more deaths. Arguably, the global impact of COVID-19 is tremendous and tremendously in a very negative way. As pointed out by Bill Gates, if you just look at things like the impacts of reducing child mortality, reducing poverty, and all the different factors that are measured by the World Health Organization in terms of key sustainability goals, all those have been set back due to this epidemic by about 25 years in just 25 weeks. However, as Bill Gates goes on to note, the innovation pipeline on vaccines is actually quite impressive. And I'll come to this in about the middle part of my talk. But first, just to provide an outline for the overall presentation. The outline runs as shown on this slide, and I run through every segment here. But I think the different words I've written on the screen here will become a little more apparent as we move forward. So first, to talk about the foundation, which I'll do in the first two segments, is the foundation was founded on two major beliefs. And really, these are quite aspirational. One is that all lives should have equal value. The second is that we should live in a world where every person has the opportunity to lead a healthy, productive life. And the fact that I said that these are aspirational beliefs suggests that it's really that neither one of these is really true today. And so let's look at some data that might suggest whether this really is an aspiration or something that's true today. One can look, for example, at a world map, and these are maps that came from a very interesting website called webmapper.org. And you see in the left here, the standard way we're used to thinking about the globe, where countries entered are represented. The size of each country is represented by the land area that they occupy. Well, you can look at this graph in different ways. You can redraw and resize the different countries by a variety of different parameters. One of those parameters you can use to resize it is by the gross national income in 2018. And now what you see is when you look at the world map this way, you can see a very large distortion with the global north being proportionally much larger and the global south being proportionally smaller. So looking at this, you can see that there is a great income disparity and equity around the globe, particularly as you run along a north-south axis. So if you think about the income disparity, what else tracks with that? One thing you can look at is healthcare. So does healthcare track with income? There's not necessarily a really great measure of healthcare, but you can look at something like the number of anesthesiologists and say perhaps that's roughly proportional or could serve as a proxy or a surrogate for people's access to higher levels of healthcare. And when you redraw now the size of each country based on the number of anesthesiologists in that country, what you see again is the same distortion. The global north being proportionally larger, and the global south, less so for South America, but particularly for Africa and Southeast Asia being proportionally smaller. So again, you see in that sense, access to higher levels of healthcare tracking somewhat with income. Does this have an impact? What's the impact of this disparity? One thing that's quite relatively topical way to look at this is look at deaths from epidemics over a 15-year period from 2001 to 2017. And what you see now is the global north has shrunk to sizes where each country is almost unrecognizable. And instead, what you see is a great swelling of the Caribbean region, Southeast Asia, and of course, most prominently, Africa. So it does appear from this representation that income tracks with access to healthcare, if you use anesthesiology as a proxy, which can track to outcomes. As a function of this, The World Bank classifies economies in each country around the world into income groups. Low, lower middle, upper middle, and high income countries, with the low and lower middle income countries being shown on this graph, on this map, in blue colors, blue to purple, and the upper middle and high income countries being shown in different shades of orange and red. Now, colloquially, we refer to these, for example, high income countries as HICS and low income countries as LMICs, and pay attention a little bit to that wording, because I'll come back to that really at the very end of the presentation. Then next, we can talk a little bit more about the foundation. And what I heard once is that every culture has its origin story, its birth story. I would postulate to you that every institution, every company, I'm certainly the University of Virginia is included in this, has their own origin story or birth story. And so let me give you the one from the birth story of the foundation. And it says that just over 20 years ago, Bill Sr., Bill's father, Melinda Gates' father-in-law, had retired and was trying to help Bill and Melinda decide what to do with the vast amount of wealth they've been fortunate enough to accumulate. They're trying to think of what to do with this, how to respond to a lot of requests they're getting for charitable donations, etc. And as this story goes, it may be somewhat apocryphal, they read a newspaper article, something like the one on the left, saying that millions of children die in countries of diseases that were eliminated long ago in the US. As Mike King mentioned, he and I first met when we were working on the rotavirus vaccine. This is something, for example, the rotavirus vaccine could be was available in the US years before it was widely used in the LMICs, lower middle income countries. And so children are still dying of that. And so they sent a note to Bill Sr. saying, Dad, maybe we can do something about this. So from the basement of Bill Sr.'s house, where Bill Sr. started off with 2 other staff members trying to decide how to set up a foundation, this has grown into the world's largest charitable philanthropic organization with an endowment of over $40 billion, giving out something on the order of $5 billion worth of grants each year, with offices located around the globe. Now, one thing when it comes to healthcare that often asks is, why do we have such an exclusive focus on healthcare in areas really outside the US, being a Seattle-based organization? Why is that? As there are healthcare inequities in the US as well. And the reason is that one of the things we really want to do with the foundation's money is to have an impact. So make sure we can have an impact. And if you look for funding in terms of healthcare R&D in the US, US pharmaceutical industry spends about $50 billion a year in R&D. The National Institutes of Health spend about $30 billion a year in terms of R&D. So while $5 billion is a lot of money, if you try to put it against an $80 billion pool, we really wouldn't be adding much impact. However, each of those groups only spend about $500 million on global health and neglected tropical diseases. And you can see here that if we play in the arena of global health and neglected tropical diseases, that $5 billion really can have a very large impact. So because of that, the foundation is focused on reducing the burden of infectious diseases and the leading cause of infant mortality in the world's poorest communities. Leading on to the next part, the power of vaccines. So as I'll show you in a minute, vaccines are one very powerful way to have an impact on global health. And to quote Melinda Gates, she says, women in the developing world know the power of vaccines, that they really know this from their personal experiences. And now I'll provide, beyond just a statement, some data to really provide support for the idea that vaccines can be a very powerful agent for global health. What you see here on the table is the morbidity, essentially number of cases for different vaccines in the 20th century, for different infectious agents in the 20th century, with annual morbidity rates running from a few hundred to hundreds of thousands. You can see in the middle column the number of cases reported in 2017, and you see that this has shrunk. this has decreased by tremendous amounts from amounts of 90 to 100% reduction between the 21st and the 20th centuries. And looking at this, what you can see is in the upper right-hand graph, and this probably is unreadable to you, so I'll tell you what's on the graph. It's talking about trends in invasive pneumococcal disease among children less than 5 years of age. On the y-axis are the number of cases per 100,000 infants, and on the x-axis is each calendar year. And what you see here is these are running around about 200 cases per 100,000 infants for years. When the vaccine against 7 of the different types of pneumococcal bacteria that cause invasive pneumococcal disease was introduced in the year 2000, you can see even within that same year of vaccine introduction, the rate dropped, and then it stayed very low for the next decade. And then about the year 2010, improved version of this vaccine was introduced that now contain an additional 6 serotypes or a vaccine that can now work against 13 of the different strains of pneumococcal bacteria that cause pneumococcal disease. And you see again, it dropped further. Now, this isn't just a feature of pneumococcal disease. You can see a very similar thing when looking at mumps in the US with, again, prior to the introduction and widespread use of the vaccine, you could have 100,000 cases or more a year. When the vaccine got introduced in the mid-70s and then got a recommendation for widespread use, you can see that drop very low. And all you now get are occasional outbreaks for mumps vaccine. We can also look at this on a global basis. And now what this graph shows you is the impact of coverage, because we talk a lot about for COVID vaccines, what coverage do you need? How many people do you need to vaccinate to really stop the transmission of coronavirus? That right now is a very debatable point, but you can look here in the case looking at measles. We're plotted here are measles cases, again in the number per million individuals on the y-axis, and now plotted instead of time, what's plotted on the y-axis is coverage. That's the percent of children of 1-year-olds who receive at least 1 dose of the measles vaccine. And what you can see is it tracks pretty much with time as more and more effort was spent by organizations like WHO, UNICEF, and Gavi that I'll talk about later, in trying to get vaccine to every infant in the world. You can see as their efforts increased to increase the coverage, you saw a corresponding decrease in measles cases, leading down to the point now where we have a coverage of about 85%. Unfortunately, that coverage also plateaued about 85%. There's still 15% of the children in the world did not get a single dose, even a single dose of measles vaccine. So 85% coverage, that's actually very good. I think there may be some people from the business school here. So the question would be just, are there any other products, I just don't know, are there any other products that actually get to 85% of their population, their target population around the globe? So the 85% number is very good, but is it good enough? In the case of measles, the answer is clearly no, because there's still 100,000 infant deaths each year of unvaccinated children. Now, measles is different than coronavirus. If you may have heard epidemiologists use the term R0, which is simply the infectious rate, the replication of the virus. And coronavirus has to estimate R0 initially of about 2.5. For measles, that's R0 value is much closer to 16 or 18, meaning it's 8 to 10 times more infectious than a coronavirus, than COVID-19 is. So I have to see what happens, what coverage is really needed for coronavirus, but it does show you here that coverage is actually very, very important. Moving on, it's hard to talk about vaccines, particularly for an engineer like myself or Mike, without talking about manufacturing, but manufacturing for vaccines is very important. One way to illustrate this, and what I've told my bosses before, is just how important is if we don't do a good job of manufacturing, you notice right away. For example, left unaddressed manufacturing issues are actually the #1 reason the FDA places development programs on clinical hold. It's called clinical hold, but usually it's on hold because there's been some issue with manufacturing or quality of the vaccine the FDA is concerned about. It's the main cause of supply shortages and sets the floor for pricing. Not so much in high-income countries where the cost of manufacturing doesn't really relate to the actual price of the vaccine. By looking at the rest of the world, particularly in developing countries in the Gavi markets, I'll come back to what that means later, it really does set the price. And manufacturing issues are not uncommon because vaccines are actually very difficult to manufacture. Vaccines and biologics like antibodies. The reason for that is really twofold. One is that vaccines are grown in living cells. Okay, so these cells have to grow and multiply. So it's somewhat like taking care of a young pet, a young child, or whatever analogy you want to make, or even a plant. You have to grow and water these constantly and feed them. They also are typically injected, so they have to be kept sterile. As I'll talk about later, what you end up needing to do is you need to construct and run your manufacturing facilities and your equipment in such a way that you protect the product from the people who are working on it, because the people working on the #1 source of contamination. So often, and always actually, it requires special manufacturing skills, tools, and equipment to grow the cells and avoid contamination of other things. The other thing is that they're very complex molecules. And although size doesn't always matter, in this case, it illustrates a very good point. And that is, if you look at the schematic in the lower right-hand part of this slide, I give a representation of a common drug. In this case, I picked Zocor, cholesterol-lowering agent with a molecular weight of about 200 Daltons. This molecule has 4 chiral centers. It's considered to be a very hard molecule to synthesize. However, if you look at something like immunoglobulin, a common antibody, it has a molecular weight of 150,000 Daltons. It's almost 1,000 times bigger than Zocor, and it probably has 1,000 times more chiral centers. And finally, you can get to a vaccine. And I show here a cryo-EM, the virus-like particle used that makes up the vaccine used for human papillomavirus to prevent cervical cancer in women. And this is a molecular weight of 20 million Daltons. So it's 100 times bigger again than antibody, which is 1,000 times bigger again than a small molecule. And this 3D structure you see there is critically important for it to mimic, to elicit an immune response that mimics that you get against the virus and helps to be protective. So all these factors make vaccines very challenging to manufacture. As a result of that, vaccine manufacturing is actually highly concentrated. This picture of the globe now, this map, by the color scheme, estimates the number of doses manufactured in different countries around the world. And what you can see when you measure this by total number of doses manufactured, the really big players are places like India, and next to that would be places like Southeast Asia, other parts of Southeast Asia, parts of Europe, and the United States. And it's actually very highly concentrated here because it's very difficult to to build these facilities, to manufacture vaccines and keep them running. The other thing to understand about vaccines is you can really group these into 5 major modalities. Where we have things like the live attenuated activated vaccines, where you basically are growing up the virus and either attenuate one in a way that doesn't grow very well in the human body. It grows well enough to invoke a good immune response, but not enough to cause disease. Or you can inactivate it. You can break into pieces and express parts of the proteins on the outside in our recombinant version. You can put them into a viral vector, so you can express instead of a viral vector, or you can take the gene itself, just as DNA or RNA, to make a vaccine. And the RNA vaccine is the one you may have heard about in the news this morning, having demonstrated very good efficacy in a phase 3 study for COVID-19. So that's very exciting news. The thing about this is these different modalities, I've actually grouped them based on manufacturing experience. So on the left-hand side, these types of vaccines have been around since the 60s. The subunit recombinant protein vaccines since the 80s, where there are very few, if any, approved viral vector or DNA RNA vaccines. So as much as manufacturing experience, there's also much less installed infrastructure. So trying to make the newer vaccines, you run into challenges. There are not many existing facilities. You just move into, start making them. You have to build those facilities. Now you can rearrange this and also rearrange in terms of what I'll call containment. As I mentioned to you, typically you design a manufacturing facility to protect the product from the people, right? To avoid the product getting contaminated. But when you're dealing with some of these vaccines that are replicating, like can replicate or infect a person, as shown on the left hand side, it's like a live attenuated inactivated viral vectors. You now also want to protect the operators from the product, because while the product may be very safe when given a single dose, a single injection, operators may be dealing with hundreds of thousands to millions of doses at a time, and that poses a different type of occupational hazard. So now you have to build a facility that protects the product from the people, but also the people from the product. And those type of facilities for the vaccines that are on the left-hand side of these are harder to make and therefore less commonly available. So this also matters from a point of view of trying to scale up manufacturing to the billions of doses, as I'll point out later, we're going to need for a COVID-19 vaccine. Last point to make in vaccine manufacturing is that the live vectors, the replicating vectors, the replicating vectors typically replicate enough in the body, or the mRNA and DNA vaccines will express a gene in the body that invokes a very good immune response. But for some of the protein in a subunit, even some of the inactivated vaccines, they need some help. And the help comes in terms of something called an adjuvant, which you mix together with the vaccine, so when you inject it into the body, you get a better immune response. However, only a few of these adjuvants have approved for human use in vaccines. There are the synthetic aluminum salts, the synthetic oligonucleotides. Both of these, as I say, synthetic means they can be synthesized using common chemistry. Assets are relatively easy to make. However, some of them, like the saponins, come from the bark of a tree. And this isn't just any tree. These actually are trees that only grow in the mountains in Chile, and you can only harvest for a few months each year. The squalene oil and water emulsions that are used for adjuvants come from the livers of shark, from deep sea sharks. In this case, a picture of a dog shark here. And as you can imagine, either harvesting from trees or harvesting from sharks is a more complex process, and it's a little bit hard to scale up these processes as well. And you need as much adjuvant as you have vaccine in order to really have these subunit and protein-based vaccines work. Actually, it wasn't. This is the last point. That wasn't the last line of manufacturing. This is the last line of manufacturing. The other point to make is that these biological agents, like a vaccine, typically aren't very stable. If you expose them to really high temperatures, they tend to fall apart and no longer work. Many of them, some of them you can store refrigerated, or even some at room temperature. Others you have to freeze for part of their life, and you might have a few months at a refrigerator temperature at which to distribute them. For the COVID-19 vaccines, the target is really to have all the vaccines be something that's either refrigerated, can be delivered, can be stored at room temperature. But some of them launch are going to have to spend part of their lives frozen and perhaps have a few months at 2 to 8 refrigerated temperatures. When we talk about the mRNA vaccines, one thing you'll hear about, if you haven't heard about already, is that these typically require that they be frozen for at least part of their life. Some of them can be frozen at -20 to -30 and spend perhaps a few weeks to a few months refrigerated temperature. This makes them a little bit easier than the next category to deliver, because the next category are ones that have to be frozen at very cold temperatures, less than -60, essentially on dry ice or liquid nitrogen, and might only have 5 days under refrigerated conditions, which you can imagine makes it very hard to distribute this, because not many doctors' offices in the US have refrigerators, for example, freezers that go to -60, and it becomes even less common as you go into low resource settings and the lower and middle income countries. So again, the storage temperature and shelf life becomes very important for distribution of these vaccines. Now, in truth, if you asked me a year ago, could people develop a vaccine against COVID-19 in less than 2 years? I would have said it's impossible. But as Nelson Mandela To quote Nelson Mandela, it always seems impossible until it's done. But just to give you some appreciation of the magnitude of the challenges here, we're talking several unprecedented things. One's unprecedented scale. We're talking about potentially wanting to vaccinate the global population of 7.8 billion people. If you consider that many of the vaccines are going to require 2 doses to be effective, that means you need to manufacture and make 16 billion doses of vaccine. To give you some idea of the magnitude of this, if this were done, for example, over a 2-year period, this would mean that we have to manufacture and deliver 200 million doses a day. That means during the course of the 40 to 60 minutes we're going to have together today, you'd have to manufacture and make almost a million doses of vaccine. That means we'd be manufacturing and delivering more than 250 doses every second, of every minute, of every hour, of every day of the year. It's a monumental task to do this at that scale. Also, unprecedented speed. As I told you, I wouldn't have believed you could develop coronavirus vaccine under 2 years. As pointed out here in the Washington Post, that's been the goal. And they pulled some data of previous attempts to develop other novel vaccines. As they point out, the fastest vaccine to be developed in the US was the mumps vaccine, which took 4 years. The longest was the vaccine for varicella, chickenpox, that took 34 years. Interesting side note here is these vaccines were both made by the same company. So it wasn't that one company was fast and one company was slow. It was the same company. It's that one vaccine was easier and one vaccine is relatively much more challenging than the other. And I started working, for example, on HIV vaccines 30 years ago when I first came to Merck. And the world is still, unfortunately, looking for an effective HIV vaccine 36 years and counting now. So typically, as we said, a normal paradigm is it takes 4 to 30 years, to more than 30 years to develop a vaccine. And from a manufacturing perspective, it has to go through a number of steps, including scaling up to manufacturing and distribution. From a clinical perspective, it has to go through phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 studies, and then on to review and approval. And as I said, the fastest been done before is 4 years. People are going to try to get this done in less than 2 years, maybe down to a year even. How are they doing that? A variety of different things. One is the coronavirus is not unknown. So COVID-19 is a type of coronavirus, but this is very similar to the viruses that are cause of Middle East respiratory syndrome and also severe acute respiratory syndrome to epidemics you may have heard of previously. So people knew that it might be quite likely if you use the spike protein, I'll show what this means later, as a target, you might be able to develop an effective vaccine. The other thing is manufacturers often wait to do these kind of scale-ups for launch scales, manufacturing scale, until they get clinical data, for example, immunogenicity data, show the vaccine works and develops an immunogenic response. So it's not to spend money completely at risk, or avoid proceeding to, at risk to manufacturing commercial scale quantities of materials, avoid investing tens to hundreds of millions of dollars until they know the vaccine works. Okay, thanks to a lot of the funding that's come out from major governments, including BARDA and Operation Warp Speed in the US, companies have been able to scale up at risk and proceed at risk to manufacturing without waiting for the clinical data. They've also overlapped or combined the phase 1, 2, and 3 studies, and the agencies are doing rolling submissions, rapid reviews, emergency use authorization. They're basically pulling out every trick in the book to try to get these moving as quickly as possible. And so with some luck, one or more manufacturers are going to meet these very aggressive timelines. And the sheer number of people who are developing vaccines is overwhelming. There are more than, this is data that comes from a couple of weeks ago, and this needs to get updated every couple of weeks from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And what this shows is there are over 200 candidates in development, over 51 candidates in the clinic, and these represent almost every type modality of vaccine that I just talked about. And as I pointed out before, this is a electron micrograph cryo-EM of the coronavirus itself, and this is the spike protein that many of these vaccines, including the one that announced that had demonstrated efficacy today, are based on the spike protein, or sometimes a smaller version of the spike protein called the receptor binding domain. And that's the vast majority of these are against those one of those two targets. How is this all going to come together? Well, there's an African proverb that says, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. So this really is taking a global effort. We've had an unprecedented breadth of response from all players, I say, including billions donated by major funding organizations and governments. Just to give an idea of the number of people that have offered help, we've even been contacted by people in the beverage industry. As I know, some vaccines can be stored in dry ice. Turns out the makers of soda, of carbonated beverages, have a lot of CO2 capacity. They've offered to help make dry ice. Some of them have to be made in these very large tanks I showed you earlier. The beer industry has offered to turn over their, it may be a shock to many people that we would run out of beer, but they've offered to turn over some of their very large fermenters for beer to make vaccine. It turns out it won't quite work in the time we need, but it's just to illustrate, these offers are coming from everywhere. So the response has been tremendous. And also, there's been a whole array of people working together, ranging from the private sector to the major public agencies. This is a slide from Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance. And I'll talk a bit more, as I have before, about the roles of the World Health Organization, UNICEF, as well as an organization called CEPI on the next couple of slides. So Gavi itself was set up about 20 years ago to deliver vaccines to people in the poorest countries around the globe, with, again, that being defined by the World Bank income levels. And prior to COVID, it delivered they had vaccinated almost 1 billion children, and in their estimate, prevented 13 to 14 million additional deaths. They're now turning that same delivery engine over to deliver COVID-19 vaccines. UNICEF, one of the United Nations organizations, is actually purchasing all these vaccines for Gavi. It's the largest single vaccine buyer in the world, and would be doing the same thing for the COVID-19 vaccines. The World Health Organization is also handling policy and allocation, and they have a goal to protect more than 1 billion people and improve the well-being of more than 1 billion people around the globe. And I mentioned CEPI, which you may not have heard about. CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, was founded 3 years ago by the governments of Norway, India, the Foundation, the Wellcome Trust, the World Economic Forum. It has a number of additional people who have now contributed to their efforts, and they're really leading the research and development efforts for COVID-19 vaccines. So they were founded 3 years ago, but are really very well placed now to really help in response to COVID-19 vaccines. They've turned over their R&D engine to that. These three organizations, Gavi, the World Health Organization, and CEPI, have united as part of the Access to COVID-19, or the ACT Accelerator, to really help reduce the risk for vaccine manufacturing, for purchasing vaccines, acquisition of vaccines, by having a portfolio of vaccines. And this portfolio of vaccines is actually the largest actively managed portfolio of COVID-19 vaccines in the world, with a goal of delivering 2 billion doses by the end of 21 and of ending the acute phase of the pandemic by the end of next year. And this gives you an idea of their portfolio, which essentially covers all the different types of modalities of vaccine that I discussed at the very beginning of the talk. And as Soumya Swaminathan, the chief researcher at WHO, what she said is that more than 180 countries have joined this COVAX facility, and they represent more than 99% of the world's population. And the vaccine manufacturers who are developing the vaccines I showed you are actually located in the same map in most of the major vaccine manufacturing countries, including one that's actually located in Australia. So coming now to the latter third of the talk, for want of a nail, I think many of you probably know this nursery rhyme, particularly since it dates back apparently to the 14th century, with the gist of being, for want of a nail, the kingdom was lost. So what does this mean relative to vaccine production? What it means is when we're looking at this vaccine manufacturing chain that I showed you before, we're looking together with CEPI and others at every part of this. Are there enough consumables that to support production of the vaccine? All of these are filled into glass vials. And we've worried about every single part of this. Are there enough stoppers for the vials? Is there enough pharmaceutical grade glass? Is there enough sterile fill finish capacity? Is there enough adjuvant? And it turns out for this, the answer to each of those was no, there's not enough. But the rubber stopper manufacturer has stepped up. CEPI has worked with the major glass suppliers to have them produce additional glass, and already starting now prior to the availability of the vaccine. The vaccine developers have largely agreed to fill, instead of a single dose in each vial, to fill 10 or 20 doses in a vial. So now you can have 20 times the efficiency of production. And based on this and the capacity that CEPI has managed to align around the world, there's enough sterile fill finish capacity. Adjuvant is something we're still working on to ensure there's going to be enough adjuvant for those vaccines that need it. So looking at every phase of this to look for bottlenecks and try to de-bottleneck it prospectively and proactively. We're also working with UNICEF and Gavi to look at the whole supply chain of how a vaccine goes from a manufacturer down to an individual. The International Air Transport Association estimated that they need the equivalent of 8,000 Boeing 747s to ship this much vaccine. So we're looking with Gavi and UNICEF to find a lot of spare capacity because we don't have time to ship vaccine by boat. We're going to have to airlift it in. I don't even know if they use Boeing 747s anymore for air transport, but we're looking at this. We're also looking at, since many of the vaccines have to be stored cold, we're looking at ways in which these can be stored cold, either in small ice packs, in small specially designed coolers, or on these more advanced coolers, that these can keep vaccines that need to be stored at temperatures like -20 or -80 cold at those temperatures for a week or more without the need for any power. UNICEF, we're also looking at all the different ways you have to distribute the vaccine around the world and making sure we're ready for it. And together, we're working with places, agencies like UNICEF to, for example, start stockpiling syringes now. So there'll be enough syringes to deliver these vaccines. I said most all the vaccines are injectable. Now for the last two sections. As Amini Mohammed, UN Deputy Secretary General, has said, what she said was, remember, no one will ever be truly safe until everyone is safe. So like I said first, so far, the response has been tremendous. It's been extremely impressive. But has it been perfect? No. There are some things we're worried about. In particular, as shown here, one of the things is the bilateral deals, the deals between an individual country and individual vaccine manufacturers to secure their doses just for their country. Vaccine nationalism, some calls it, versus having it broadly distributed and broadly available. And if you look here at what's happened through these deals, if you look at the graph here on the left, what you see is many countries, United Kingdom, US, Canada, Japan, Europe, the European Union, etc., have secured enough vaccine to vaccinate their population many times over. As a matter of fact, if you add these all up, as shown on the graph on the right, what you see is relative to the population, as shown in the box here, in high-income countries, the amount of vaccine that's been secured is enough to vaccinate those countries 3, 4, 5 times over. While if you look at the population in the lower and lower middle incomes, it's called LMICs, as I said at the very beginning, probably only 1 in 5. There's only enough vaccine right now that's guaranteed to go there for 1 in every 5 individuals. So on one hand, this seems to be a disappointingly high amount of inequity, and it seems unfair. But the question is, does it matter? Should it matter to people in high-income countries? Two ways to look at this. This is for a study that came out from Northeastern, where they estimated that if you took 3 billion doses of vaccine and delivered the first 2 billion to the 50 50 richest countries and left only $1 billion for the rest of the world, you could save lives. You would save a fair number of lives by compared to having no vaccine at all. So if you instead to take that same 3 billion doses of vaccine and distribute equitably around the world, you would double the number of lives saved. So an additional 300,000 lives could be saved from under their modeling scenario. So yes, it does matter from a point of view of saving lives around the world. It also matters economically. This is from a report by the RAND Corporation. And what they show is compared to a world without vaccine, if the vaccine nations, if those richest countries got their vaccine, they could reduce the loss of GDP, of gross domestic product, by a couple of $1 trillion, which is a very large sum of money. However, if one invested, frankly, just a few billions of dollars more to ensure we had vaccine that was also distributed to the low income and the middle and lower middle income countries, you could save an additional $1 trillion in terms of impact to the global economy in terms of GDP. So it certainly makes economic sense to provide vaccine equitably. It makes humanitarian sense to provide vaccine equitably around the world. So my last part, heaven or hell. So for this, I go to quote Dag Hammarskjöld, who was Secretary General of the UN back in the 50s. He points out the United Nations was not created to take mankind to heaven, but to save humanity from hell. So while the response for COVID vaccine has not been perfect, we're not yet in heaven. The creation of organizations like CEPI, the role that Gavi is playing, that UNICEF is playing, that the World Health Organization is playing, the donors and the countries who have contributed to this already are certainly keeping us from hell. But there's more that could be done and should be done. So I leave you with these final words from the ACT Accelerator itself to act now, act together, and act boldly. So I appreciate your time and happy to take questions.
Thank you, Dave. That was terrific. So we do have some questions that have been submitted, and so we'll go over those. What new technologies being used for COVID-19 vaccine development are you most excited about, and why? And how can you envision them being used for other diseases in the future? You're muted, Dave.
Sorry, I was going to say, drink my tea. So one of the most, that's really interesting is you're taking some of these new modalities, like the viral vectors I talked about and the mRNA vaccines, they have been used a lot before. And what those have both offered is a lot of speed. And in particular, the mRNA vaccines are those, you can just swap out the gene representing the surface protein or antigen on a new virus very quickly and grow it in the same platform or manufacture in the same platform. And so the question has always been, will those work? And so there's two real exciting things about for those that don't know, Pfizer announced today that their Data Safety Monitoring Board had said that their vaccine, at least in the initial, I think it's 43,000 patients that they studied, had 90% efficacy. A strikingly high efficacy number. So it shows two things. One is that mRNA vaccine can develop both an immune response, but immune response that's effective. Two, it said that vaccines against the spike protein might just work, which is really important because so much of that portfolio is based on that spike protein, that outer coat, somewhat like your logo for the Infectious Disease Institute, those spike proteins. Two very important things.
Okay. For the general public, what components of global supply chain are most likely to be issues for vaccine development and distribution?
Initially, it's going to be cold chain. You're going to hear a lot about cold chain for the next couple of months because the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines are both mRNA vaccines that both require the most cold storage are the ones in the lead, and the other vaccines are a few months behind. And so you hear a lot about cold chain storage. So cold chain storage will be one, adjuvants then will become another one. They'll hear a lot about for supply of those and how to get it to every person around the globe. Because as we said, nobody's safe until everyone's safe. Those are the things I think that will be particularly interested to see how this play out.
Okay, and in your talk, you showed about the temperature issue. One of the questions that came before the the announcement today. Is there a vaccine in development that looks like it will be more than 50% effective and will not need to be refrigerated?
So we know not need to be refrigerated at all is going to be a challenge.
Right.
But if you look at some of the ones that will be coming out, the viral vector-based ones, the protein-based ones, many of those can probably be shipped refrigerated, for which there's, because of polio, which also needs to be shipped refrigerated, there's a pretty good global supply chain out there. So that will be much easier to distribute broadly than some of the ones that have to be stored at ultra cold temperatures. And hopefully those will be equally efficacious, but the data has to come out.
Okay. And I want to jump down to another one. As you talked about in your talk, you talked about the pandemic response was necessary to gain commitment to common solutions when there are many different viewpoints, global developers, countries, regulatory agencies. You know, what process did you see was most successful to do this, to get to the standard multi-dose glass vial, to address the labeling issues, barcoding, those type of things?
What it does, it takes a lot of communication against a lot of different people, because it's something that old story of people who are blindfolded trying to determine what's in front of them. It turns out it's an elephant, and one person has the tail, and one person has the trunk, and they guess completely different animals. Everybody knows a part of this, myself included, and they know that very well. But you have to understand, if I develop a vaccine that has to be stored at ultra cold temperature, that may sound, it's perfectly fine if you're working in the lab where you've got liquid nitrogen freezers. It may not work so well in the real world. So everybody has to understand everybody's different point of view. Or if you freeze a vaccine down, turns out once you've frozen that thing, it's very hard to put a label on there. So before you freeze it, you have to know where you're going to ship it. Or you need to have one label that works around the globe, and people have to agree that the labels all give you in the same language. So you can't, once frozen, you can't relabel this. So everyone has to understand each other's point of view and the constraints that each person faces. And so it really takes a lot of communication, a lot of listening, and a lot of understanding.
Okay, and this one kind of follows off on that one. This pandemic response required collaboration and teamwork across multiple organizations and countries. As a university, how can we teach or prepare our students for them to be successful in such a diverse global effort? I mean, how do you train people to learn more than their own discipline?
I mean, it's really challenging, because you do need depth in your field to be really good, but you also need the breadth, right? So one has to avoid being too heavily solid. Why depth is good, because you need that solid foundation. You also have to have breadth. And so how do you do this? How do you get students to work in teams? How do you get students to work with someone from another department? It's challenging to do, particularly a large university. My thinking was always been, if you want people to collaborate, you should only have one cafeteria and one bathroom, right? Because then everyone runs into each other. But you can't do that at a large university. So you have to find other mechanisms to get people to work together and to actually talk to each other, understand each other.
Thank you. And just a couple more. I think we're about out of time. But one has to do with the tech transfer. What's the relative difficulty of transferring technology associated with the different vaccine platforms or modalities you talked about?
It's very challenging. So that's one of the big challenges to get to these large scales. As I said, no one, particularly the new modalities, no one has one facility big enough to really manufacture for everybody. And so you have to collaborate together with other developers and with contract manufacturing organizations, but each time they have to transfer the process there. And you can't transfer this just with paper. You're really trying to transfer both a lot of explicit as well as a lot of implicit knowledge. And that certainly is a challenge that you have to overcome.
Okay. And the last one I guess going through is, after the vaccine's been shown to be validated, safe and efficacious, does the foundation have plans for outreach or campaigns? And there's also the issue about anti-vax sentiment and how you address that. I know that's a big issue for everybody.
It certainly is a big issue. People have to have, many people have lost faith in institutions, right? You have to try to restore that faith. So it has to be transparent processes, examples. The WHO, the World Health Organization, is working to make certain where there's a regulatory review of that. They bring in regulators from other countries all together, so they can all participate in that discussion, and they can understand that, yes, there was an open discussion about the data. Yes, people considered all of the issues. And that way, if it's approved, they can have more faith they can use it safely in their country. So you have to continue to do things like that, where you have much more transparency, you have open discussions. and allow people to participate, and you get to the people that people trust. You know, if it's a local community leader, that local community leader, he or she has to be very confident. If it's a local religious leader, again, he or she has to be very comfortable with the process and confident with it, because that's who people turn to when they have a lack of trust in major institutions, is the people close to them who they can trust.
So you have to show safety and efficacy, and it has to be by an organization they trust.
Safety and efficacy by organization you trust, by a process they believe is transparent, and there weren't things hidden from them.
Okay. Now I'll stop there, and thank you again very much for the talk, and turn it back over to Allison to kind of wrap things up. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you again, David. That was a fantastic presentation. Thank you so much. It was comprehensive and covered all of the topics that I think have been on a lot of our minds. And really want to thank you for your time and joining us today. And I think it's given all of us a lot of food for thought. Hopefully the news will continue to get better from here. And I'd like to thank Mike for serving as the moderator for this webinar, inviting you to come speak today, David, was really fantastic. So I want to let everybody know a recording of this webinar will be made available on our website shortly, giddy.virginia.edu. Thank you for attending, and I hope you'll continue to attend Giddy webinars going forward. Thanks everybody for a wonderful day.
Great. Thank you, and thank you for your time.